So, what do you do if you love to spin, but you're kind of getting tired of knitting? Hey, this is Kathy with Wool Maven, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, this is kind of going to be a little bit of a shorter podcast, but I wrote down some thoughts because I have to say, we're getting into story time here. Sometimes I just actually, not sometimes, a lot. My by far favorite is spinning. I really, really, really like to spin. And sometimes I feel like knitting, which is the my go-to yarn craft, but I'm not saying I'm super great at it, certainly not. I did actually learn to knit just to use my handspun. So I end up with the quandary of, hey, what am I going to do with all this yarn? And then sometimes I just like to spin. I just plain like to spin. So I'm just kind of pumping out the yarn just because I want to try a new technique or I want to try a new fiber. And then I've got all this yarn. I've got all this yarn. So what do I do with it? Well, I have some ideas. And some of it is if you're not some of it is actually very different ideas of what to do with your yarn other than knitting. And some of it is just a little bit of a different twist. So you'll still probably end up knitting or crochet, whatever your main thing is. But it at least for me, it gives me a whole different outlook on what I'm doing. So my first thought is, have you tried felting? Felting is super fun. I and felting certainly isn't new. Cripes, I've been spinning for more than 20 years, but I used to try felting. I would try and try and try, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, everybody's so worried about, if I look at my wool wrong, it'll felt." And mine wouldn't felt. Gosh, was that frustrating. That's because I didn't realize that we had one of the I'll go with few breeds that actually don't felt all that well. We have mainly Dorset sheep, so if you've worked with Dorset or any of the down type breeds, then felting them is that's a tough one. So, even though I've been spinning for a while, I mainly use stuff from our flock. So until I started purchasing in, gosh, I just didn't have much to felt, and now we do actually have one colored sheep, and she felts. So, I love that fleece. But felting and true, most of the time, I would still be knitting the fabric to felt, but wow, is it fun, and it gives you a whole new almost like a whole new project. And I do have to admit, it is somewhat a little bit of the Wild West out there. I do the machine felting, so I just stick it in the washing machine, generally in like a little mesh bag. And otherwise, anything else linty in the load, the lint will end up on your felt. So, word to the wise, if you don't want all the lint that would normally end up in your dryer trap, if you don't want all that on your felt, go for the mesh bag first. Anyway, I've done some really, really fun little projects like little coasters and even something more of a purse. And then I just did some experimental felting today with different wool types together to see how they act. So I just did a little swatch and put that in the washer and it came out pretty good. So that project's definitely a go, at least so far. So felting is a pretty fun one to kinda get you out of your knitting rut. Once again, you would actually have to probably knit it first, but you could crochet, you could do Tunisian crochet, you got some options there. The next thing is if you are mostly a knitter, why not try a different yarn craft? Crochet is the first one that comes to mind. Tunisian crochet is pretty fun. It makes a really nice, sturdy fabric, you could go for that, and those are just the first 2 that I tend to think of, and there's more, of course. And then another option is weaving, and I have to admit, weaving catches my eye. It really, really does, but I do not have, um thinking about a rigid heddle loom, I don't have one, but that definitely be my go-to were I to get one. But what I did to kind of satisfy the weaving bug was to make a peg loom, and my husband helped me, and I'll tell you what, if you or someone you love is the least little bit handy, a peg loom, gosh, it's pretty easy to make, especially if you have the tools, because 'cause you'll need, like, a drill and a saw and such, but it's easy. I made mine out of a 2 by 4 and some which I had like four dowel rods, four 48-inch dowel rods that I got at it, Home Depot is the store in town. And then a saw called a dovetail saw, so you could cut the little dowel rods off. And the total I spent was $25. So it took a little time and in like drilling the holes, making some plans, doing a little bit of experimentation to see what we liked, and then cutting off all the dowel rods and then sanding it up. But gosh, you can put together a peg loom really fast, and a peg loom can really move through the yarn. I find when I have a lot of yarn just stacking up, whip out the peg loom, and you can really put a lot of yarn to good use. And it's not my peg loom is pretty wide. It's I'd say 4 feet wide, but you don't have to put all the pegs in. You can make it 2 feet wide. You can make it as long as you want, right? It's adjustable. But I I really like the fact that if I got something to spin and I generally knit things first and then I didn't really care for how it turned out or it wasn't what I thought it would do, it still makes cool yarn and then just put it in the peg loom and you can make little patterns. Nothing as complicated as you'd be able to do with like a floor loom, of course, but still it's cool. I made one that was like a tiger stripe, but anyway, I like it. It's a good way to use your yarn and it's not knitting. So if you're stacking up your yarn, consider a peg loom. Then the other thing I was thinking of is, and this would still be with your main needle. So whether that's knitting or crochet, but I find, at least for me, when I feel like I I love to spin, but what do I do with the thing, right? What do I do with the yarn that I made? Changing up my spinning a little bit to kind of spice it up really makes a difference to me in the project. So even though I'd still be knitting the final thing because I spun a cool yarn to begin with, that makes a world of difference to me. So an easy way to take, at least for me, take my spinning from kind of blah, um, or gosh, I've been doing a lot of this and I'm looking for something a little bit cooler, is to go with a gradient. So put yourself together a gradient. You can use your drum carder, you can use a blending board. Um, the really neat visual changes that does a lot for me. Another one is add-ins. So you could put in sparkle. I've been doing a lot with spinning just a base yarn for hats, and this just happened to be Tunis. And then every once in a while, just knit in right on top as I'm knitting, and I'm doing a hat here, knitting right on top just these really lovely, super bright colored locks of this Lincoln cross. And the locks were a little bit too much or a little bit too coarse for me to like next to skin, but using them as an accent in a different knitted fabric, those were really cool. Really cool. And it kept the knitting. So while I was still obviously knitting, it kept the knitting fun and interesting. And I was be able to add like a pattern almost on top of a pattern in that the accent locks did something neat. And that made a world of difference to me. It took what would have been like kind of standard issue knitting and made it fun. So that was a big difference. Then the other thing I would almost challenge you to do is break out of your rut. Break out of your rut. I know, at least for me, that there tends to be a certain way that I spin when I sit down, and if I'm not thinking, then I just do a certain type of yarn and a certain thickness. But what if you went with a thick and thin? What if you did I'm working right now with a little bit different of a lock structure. It's a lamb fleece that's Romney, Blueface Leicester, and I think Lincoln. But lovely, lovely dark color, but it's soft. And I just let a little bit of the tips and the tails kind of stick out when I spin it. So just separate out the locks and it makes a beautiful textured yarn with little like puffy bits sticking out. It's super fun. But and that's just a teeny change that makes a big difference to me. It does take a little bit longer to spin, but it makes the knitting fun because you don't know, it almost makes like a lace with a little bit of like a variety pack of where the little puffs stick out. I really like it. It's super fun and it adds some interest and keeps me like expanding my spinning. But and then what do I do with it? Well, if even though it's still knitting, if the results are visually different, are visually compelling to me, then it works for me that even though it's still knitting, like I said, it's still pretty fun. And then the final thing would be small projects. I find that if I and once again, still knitting, I find that if I kind of build up this big project in my mind and then I feel like I have to do all this knitting. And honestly, I don't like that. I don't like that. It's self-imposed pressure, but if I keep the project small and fun, then it's exciting to start it and I get it done in a couple days and then I move on to something else. And that really keeps the knitting fun and interesting and allows me to change up what I'm doing. So that's it for today. Hopefully that helps you out. If you are new to spinning, I would like to invite you to check out my course. It's at woolmaven.com/spinning course. It's a spinning course developed specifically for beginners. So love to have you there if you're interested. Either way, have a super day and see you next time.